Everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Fitness Education Series produced by the Australian Fitness Academy. It's like progressive overload for your brain. I'm your host, Tom Rock, and today's episode we're going to do a research review with Tom and Luke. And this is going to be, we're going to start a bit of a series, and we'll try to get these out to you fairly regularly. Just a bit of a session where Luke, thanks for coming, Luke.
Thanks, Tom.
Luke and I will have a look at some of the sort of recent literature reviews that are coming out. A bit of a discussion about them. We'll look at it, what the papers talk about, and then look to see how you could potentially apply or how it may affect you in exercise prescription or programming or health and nutrition, whatever the paper's on, how it might sort of apply to you. So hopefully some good little series and informative episodes that you can look to take on board. So we'll look to get it started now, and yeah, sure, a few more of these will roll out in 2025. So let's get started. Luke, kick us off with the review that or the literature article that we've decided to go with today.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Today we're looking at the title of the article is Genetics of Exercise and Diet-Induced Fat Loss Efficiency, and it's a systematic review. So in a nutshell, what we're looking at here is the effects of genetics on exercise and diet-induced fat loss, and I'm sure for many of your listeners here that's a pretty interesting topic. Basically, looking at how much of a role does genetics play in your ability to lose weight, lose fat, and I'm sure that's relevant in your professional practice. Now, just to add a bit to that, it's a systematic review, which means it's not an individual study as such. It's actually reviewing all of the current studies out there in the area and just providing an overall sort of look and an overall outcome based on all the studies that are currently out there. It's a 2024, so it's this year, it's new, and it is in the Journal of Sports Science and Medicine. It was a you probably agree, it was a decent read. At points it got a little bit sciencey, which we'll probably try and avoid. But
we'll jump in there. We will post a link. You might not be able to find the full article, but we'll post a link to the article in the description of the podcast. So yeah, if you get a chance, jump on, you can have a look at it as well.
Absolutely, yeah. So that'll be good too. Not too bad of a read, but there is some science stuff in there, but some really good, what I think we both would agree will be some practical stuff we can bring forward to you. I won't try and pronounce the names of the authors because that's not going to work. They're from Russia, basically.
I go down that some route sometimes, and it doesn't end well on the podcast.
Yep.
Just fluffing through them. But yeah, so a bit of a, I guess, to get us started, how would you sum up? Like, what does the article try to explain, do you think?
Yeah, I think as the name suggests of the article, it's sort of a bit of self-explanatory there. It just looks at the effects of different genetic factors or genotypes on whether it be exercise-related fat loss or weight loss outcomes, or diet-related fat loss or weight loss outcomes. So as we know, like if you're trying to lose weight, lose fat, we're going to use them collectively here, but they're slightly different, but we'll use them for the sake of the argument. We use them as the same thing to a degree. Basically, we know that you need to have some sort of exercise combined with diet, some sort of restriction of calorie intake, and combined, that's probably going to have the best effect on weight loss. But the question is, outside of that, how does genetics play a role in each of those individual factors? And that's what it's looking at.
Yes, and I think it's a good, just generally, if you don't look at the scientific side, like you'll probably know in your own practice or just through people you know, and Luke's probably worked with people in the past as well, you could give the same program or weight loss program or same exercise routine to two people and you'll get different results. And genetics is generally comes up as a play in terms of that's what makes a difference. Why do I lose weight on this program or this diet and this other person doesn't lose weight on this diet program?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was certainly one of the takeaways, obvious takeaways, is what you've just outlined there. And an example they gave, which was quite relevant, is, there are obese Olympians out there.
Yep.
So you can't just sort of suggest that if someone does a whole bunch of exercise and they follow a decent diet, that guarantees them to not be a certain body weight, body fat percentage, or whatnot. Whether it be wrestlers, whether it be heavyweight boxers. I mean, they train as hard as anyone, but you still see what would probably be, some of them will be classified as, close to obesity.
Yep.
It's just the way it is, and genetics plays a big role there.
So yeah, I guess we sort of touched on takeaways there. But do you think there's any big takeaways from this article? How do you best see this utilised? It's sort of, or where would you start?
In terms of where I'd start is, I guess, let's take a back step. Let's sort of break down before we go into the genetic factors. Let's break down the whole idea of diets inducing fat loss and weight loss.
Yep.
So what's important to know about diets and fat loss and weight loss is there are definite short-term benefits to specific diets which will have really strong outcomes for weight loss. Okay, whether it be your high protein, low carb, your hypo, really low calorie diets, they can have some really significant impacts on short-term weight loss. But the longitudinal studies on diet-induced fat loss and weight loss basically say the same thing, and that no matter what diet you sort of go on, or the composition of that diet in terms of macronutrients, you're probably going to end up in the same spot as long as you follow that diet for that whole period of time.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the key takeaways, and this is something I often talk about with the students, and it's such an easy question to answer when you get asked this question, but it's also the most unsatisfying answer from a student or from someone who you're talking to about this. A question you'll get all the time is, what is the best diet for me? Or what diet should I follow? Which one is the best?
Yep.
And the answer is really easy, but it's so unsatisfying. And for me, it's the one you can stick to. That's the answer.
Yep, that's the answer, yep.
So the one you can stick to over the long term is the one that's going to be best for you. In the short term, we can have different discussions, right? But in long term, it's the one you can stick to. Obviously, it needs to have some sort of health-based, backdrop to it. It can't just be a silly diet. But if you can stick to whatever diet you can stick to, or healthy eating plan you can stick to over the long haul, is the best one for you. And that was, again, in this research, something that I took away as well.
Yeah, it was a key takeaway. I think they talked about consistency over time a lot. And being something you can stick to. I think did you look at the exercise much and talk about aerobic exercise? What did you think about that? Because I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah. So that's again another age-old argument of the type of resistance training and the effect it has on fat loss.
Yeah.
And they talked a bit, which you know if you're a student here, about obviously aerobic style training. So your longer, lower intensity exercise is going to draw its energy from fat stores to a greater degree than your higher intensity exercise. We know that, and therefore potentially is a better method there for fat loss. But again, the question around that, there's more to talk about here, but the question around that particular point is, it's always the same thing. So that's true in that you will use a lot more energy from fat at lower intensities, but how long do you need to exercise for to achieve the overall calorie expenditure or kilojoule expenditure? Do you have the hours upon hours a day to get the energy expenditure high enough at that intensity to make it beneficial? Or do you only have 45 minutes and therefore you need to go hard out, maximize energy expenditure? Yes, it's coming from a different source, which may not be as directly related to fat loss, but it's an individual thing again, isn't it?
Yeah, and I can't find the exact spot, but there is a section that talks about how the overall fat loss wasn't necessarily related to what energy stores were being utilized in the exercise. So even if they were doing, it was something about there was something in there about a group of females, I think, that did a sprint program, and they lost just as much fat or more fat than the people who did long slow distance. So it's not necessarily correlated with the energy source that you're utilizing within the exercise in terms of fat loss.
What did you make from the resistance training side of things?
Yeah, and I think the overall takeaway was probably similar to what we would say in terms of it's important to maintain muscle mass in a weight loss scenario as much as possible to keep your metabolism high. But they sort of did state, and this is what I sort of got, that in terms of fat loss, resistance training isn't necessarily probably the go-to, I would think. Like they sort of suggested aerobic training is more useful for weight loss.
And they even suggested that that's still the case, even if you combine resistance training and aerobic training. That aerobic training alone had a more beneficial effect But the question then becomes, okay, what are the other benefits of resistance training?
Yes, exactly. So then when they got to sort of looking at obese people and getting healthier, resistance training's got a whole lot of other benefits too. One of them is maintaining muscle mass, which is going to maintain your sort of metabolic rate as you do lose weight. And hopefully they did sort of started the article with saying people lose a lot of weight then tend to just put it back on. And resistance training potentially assists in mitigating that as much as possible.
So putting the two together, we talked about diet and we talked about the effects of exercise. Based on that, what would you suggest for our listeners in terms of the ideal sort of program style setup for someone who's trying to lose weight?
Yeah, well, I think it highlights the importance. Again, sometimes it's easy to forget the importance of aerobic training on weight loss. Sometimes, especially if you're in the gym a lot or you're running PT sessions, potentially they're always in the gym. So you think, well, I should be utilizing the resistance training equipment, and we're here to build muscle, and that's generally what training's for, which is good. But highlighting that it probably needs to be a good mix of aerobic in there. So whether you prescribe aerobic training outside the PT sessions or you have them doing some sort of aerobic training in the sessions. But yeah, I would say a combination is good and potentially lean towards more aerobic stuff if possible. So it might be 2 resistance sessions a week and then you mix in aerobic around that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that. So, if you break it down to a percentage, as you've sort of just outlined there, you probably have a slightly higher percentage of aerobic style training versus resistance training. As we've discussed, the type of aerobic training, depends on the individual's factors. If they have, and also their training status and their fitness level. If they have ample time to exercise, then maybe you might go for that longer distance training. If they don't, well, your aerobic training is going to have to come in the form of higher intensity exercise to maximize energy expenditure. But I think what the other key takeaway from this was the actual style of training didn't actually matter unless the energy intake
is lower.
There was a restriction there. So that's the most important factor.
So activity is good. It definitely has a lot of health benefits, and will help increase energy expenditure. But yeah, if they're eating more, no matter how much aerobic exercise they're doing, if they're eating more than they're expending, they're probably not going to lose body fat.
Correct. And again, a practical takeaway from that though, as well, is if they're looking for a short-term fix, then some of these diets out there, with different compositions of macronutrients, higher protein, lower. You just have to work out which one is more suitable for your client, and you'll probably get some short-term results. But if you want some long-term sustained results, they're probably going to have to follow something which is more manageable, which allows them to exercise at certain intensities and get through the day.
Yeah, so I think in my takeaway, it's like sometimes people obviously get results on diets because that's still a big fad, and people go, well, I'm just going to diet, and they'll lose 10 kilos in a month and be like, yep, I lost 10 kilos, but probably not necessarily the healthiest way and potentially likely to rebound. So I think in my opinion, there's difference between diet and healthy eating, where you can sort of manage your kilojoules and eat slightly in a deficit and just not be super restrictive like a diet is, or people will go on a diet and be like, they'll want carbohydrates or whatever it is, and then lose a lot of weight quickly, but as soon as they go back to what they were doing or they stop that diet, the weight sort of goes back on rather than making long-term changes.
Yeah, so I think that was some generic sort of takeaways in relation to diet and exercise, but then it sort of got into the actual genetic factors and genetic variables.
So we were not going to go into all the different genes and types of genes, but basically we've all got genes.
With a G?
With a G, yes. And they looked at what's called different polymorphisms, which is basically slight changes in each of our gene expressions, I would say. And yeah, if you want to read the paper, you can sort of go into more than that, but it looks at different genotypes for each gene, which will have different ones.
Yeah, and the question from that was, what effects do those different genotypes have in relation to the exercise you perform? So how might I respond differently to a certain exercise type than Tom does based on my genotype? And also the same question in relation to the diet we follow. How might my genotype affect the diet I follow and my response to it? And I think the first thing, one of the things I took away from that were what determines whether or not a genotype is favourable for fat loss. So a certain genotype might be more favourable for fat loss, whether it be exercise or diet, because it relates in enhanced metabolism. It results in improved nutrition utilization, nutrient utilization. It's more efficient utilization of fat for energy source during activity. So there's some of the factors which determine that outcome for that genotype.
Yep.
As Tom said, we're not going to go into the specific names of the genotypes because that's beyond the scope here. But from that information, what they found was that there were 24 genetic markers which responded to exercise favorably when it comes to fat loss, and there were 30 genetic markers which responded to fat loss favorably in relation to diet.
Yep.
So we may or may not have them, or we may have a different way of utilizing them or expressing them. So that's the difference between one individual and the next. Is that the way you sort of looked at it?
Yep, that's the way I sort of look at it. And did you want to go through any specific examples or not?
You can. It's going to be. It might go a little bit over people's head, but
yeah,
I
don't think I want to go into it because I think one of my takeaways from reading this is that it's all good and well, but if someone's not carrying the gene expressions that's going to help them, there's not a lot I can do. There's nothing I can change. For some of these genes that list, it's like I either have it or I don't, and I've got a slightly higher chance of reduced body fat.
Yep.
But one of the genes that looked at diet, that I thought this was probably the most interesting one for me, is that there was two groups and it was looking at the same sort of gene, but one did a low fat, and there was another study that did a high protein. But basically, it showed that individuals with this certain genotype lost significantly more body mass and fat mass and waist circumference on a low fat diet compared with those on a low carbohydrate diet. So
that's a big difference in what you're eating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Massive. So and I think it's a good example to show, whereas people with who had the other type, it didn't matter what diet they used. They got comparable results on low fat or low carbohydrate. And I just think that's an important thing to understand, that not all people respond to the same diets the same.
Yeah, and I think that's my practical takeaway.
Yes.
It's pretty generic sort of general takeaway, but as a PT, you need to understand that you can't have this sort of one sort of mindset, cookie cutter approach to whether it's exercise or diet. You have to sort of play around with type of exercise you perform, all the variables related to that, and also maybe some variables around how they eat, when they eat, what they eat, and try and find that best approach for them. Now, it's all well and good for us to say that you need the DD genotype, but how are you as PT going to know that?
Yep.
So that's the point. You're not going to know that. You can't know that likely at this point. So you're going to have to play around and not assume that because one diet worked for this client, it's going to work exactly the same for another client. You have to have that mindset, and I think that's what this paper promotes.
Yep. That's definitely one of my big takeaways. That it does show that obviously we know there is a difference, but it can help. Yeah, just reiterate that not everything is going to work the same for every single client.
Yeah.
I think.
And I think that was the current sort of application, I thought. But there was a future application which talked about at the end, where it's like, well, maybe in the future where the industry is going is that there will be easy testing of the genotypes.
You can actually get
your test
done.
Yeah, you can do it.
You can sign up, and I've done it.
You've done it?
Yep.
What was involved?
Just use saliva in a tube, send it off, analyze it, and then they just send you back. There's different companies that do it, but then they'll just analyze and they just send you back heaps of data.
Yep.
It's unbelievable.
Well, there you go. So if you have that information at hand, you've got all these studies to see what method worked.
Again, it's not necessarily cheap, and it's not going to be Again, you look at it and it's not necessary.
No,
it shouldn't be necessary, and you shouldn't have to send your client, oh, well, in order to train you, I'm going to need you to go get this genetic testing. Not necessary. Most things are going to work, and that's where you come in to individualize it based on their progress, I think.
Yeah, definitely not necessary at the moment, but one day it might be as simple as touching an app, putting your finger, scanning a finger on an app, and that's when the future. You never know what's going to come about and how easy it might be.
Yep.
And who knows? Maybe one day we're creating training programs and diets based purely on your genes.
Yep. And I wouldn't be surprised if that happened.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think overall it was a pretty good systematic review. Really.
thought
What do you
so
think?
too. Nah, yeah, it was good, easy to read. I'd encourage students to read it, as Tom said. There'll be a link to it, so
Yeah, I'll put a link to at least the yeah, to find it. It is a bit of a read, but yeah, I think the main takeaways are a good one. How it just shows difference. Again, I don't necessarily like pigeonholing people either in genes when I'm trying to train them. I think that's one of my big things is you don't want to give people excuses a lot of time. Oh, I can't lose weight because my genes are no good.
yeah,
What do you like?
yeah, absolutely, yeah,
That's and definitely, obviously, after reading papers and reading things, there's genes out there that are going to make it a little bit harder or probably predispose you to being obese. But you can always improve your health, I think.
absolutely, yeah. I think one thing I'd like, obviously, as we continue on this sort of approach to these podcasts,
Yep.
however often we do them, it'd be great if your listeners, as they often do, write in and say, I want to learn more about this topic. Can you look at some research and let
Yep.
us know? I think that would really help as
Yeah,
well.
definitely. If you guys have any thoughts on topics, or you see a paper out there on Instagram or something, yeah, let us know. We can happy to have a read of it and review it and give you our takes on papers in future. But yeah, anything else on that one, Luke?
No, that's good.
Awesome. Well, hopefully you got a bit out of it, guys, and you can look forward to a few more of these research reviews with Luke and Tom in the future. But other than that, have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you all soon.